In 1789, King Louis XVI of France sat secure on a throne that had endured for 8 centuries, convinced that divine right and royal tradition would shield him forever. In 1917, Tsar Nicholas II commanded an empire stretching across 11 time zones, ruling 180 million people under the firm belief that God himself had appointed him to lead. And in 1959, Fidel Castro was merely a 29-year-old lawyer, recently released from prison after a failed uprising, dismissed by most as a fringe agitator with no real power. All 3 men were profoundly mistaken. Their government's seemingly unassailable structures of authority crumbled within months, once a hidden pattern reached its 4th stage. This is not coincidence or isolated tragedy. Over the past 250 years, 3 major regimes have followed the identical 6-stage sequence that ends in the complete destruction of the old order. France, in 1789, descended into terror and dictatorship. Russia, in 1917, fractured through civil war into totalitarian control. Cuba, in 1959, transformed from a prosperous Caribbean hub into a closed communist state that endured for 6 decades. Each time, the elites at the top never saw the collapse coming. They believed their systems were too entrenched, their privileges too permanent, their people too passive. History proved otherwise. Every single time. Tonight, on Collapse Rewind, I will lay out this 6-stage revolutionary cycle with precision drawing from economic data, social dynamics, and the unyielding logic of human behavior under pressure. We will examine how inequality builds silently, how corruption erodes trust, and how the middle class, once the stabilizer of any society, becomes the spark that ignites the fire. Then, step by step, we will position the United States in 2025 against this framework. The assessment is not alarmist. It is measured, grounded in verifiable trends you encounter daily in rising costs that outpace wages, in headlines that reveal institutional failures, in the quiet erosion of confidence that the system still works for most Americans. We are not predicting doom for its own sake. Understanding this pattern is the first line of defense. Revolutions do not begin with barricades in the streets. They begin when enough people conclude that peaceful change is no longer possible. As John F. Kennedy observed in 1962, those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. If we recognize the stages early, we retain the option to interrupt them. Stay with me through the full analysis. By the end, you will see exactly where America stands today at Stage 4, and grasp both the speed at which Stage 5 can emerge and the narrow pathway that still exists to pull back from the edge. To begin, we must first define what a true revolution is, and why it strikes not from absolute poverty, but from a far more dangerous force, the widening chasm between what people expect and what they receive. Most people picture a revolution as crowds marching with signs, tear gas in the air, or perhaps a single dramatic storming of a palace. That image captures only the surface noise. A true revolution is far quieter in its origins and far more absolute in its outcome. It occurs the instant a sufficient portion of society, whether armed soldiers, educated professionals, or ordinary voters, collectively declares the existing social contract invalid. The rules that once bound citizens to their government, the implicit promise that effort will be rewarded and grievances addressed, are deemed broken beyond repair. From that point forward, the old order is no longer reformed. It is dismantled and replaced, often with something less stable and more oppressive than what existed before. Poverty by itself has never been the spark. For millennia, the majority of humanity has lived in material scarcity without overthrowing the structures above them. What changes the equation is not the absolute level of hardship, but the relative gap between what people have come to expect and what they actually receive. In stable societies, expectations remain modest or are gradually met through incremental progress. In pre-revolutionary societies, expectations rise through education, exposure to prosperity, or promises from leaders, While delivery stagnates or regresses, the resulting frustration is not merely economic, it is psychological and moral. Citizens begin to view the elite, not as distant benefactors but as active obstacles to a life they believe they have earned. This dynamic explains why revolutions frequently erupt in nations that appear prosperous on paper. France in the 1780 seconds boasted the most advanced culture in Europe. Yet bread riots toppled the monarchy. Russia, in 1917, fielded the world's largest army, yet soldiers mutinied over empty stomachs. Cuba in the 1950 seconds ranked among Latin America's wealthiest countries per capita. Yet rural children died untreated, while Havana casinos glittered. In each case, the decisive factor was not destitution but disillusionment, the conviction that the system had become rigged to protect a narrow circle while denying the broader population its rightful share. John F. Kennedy articulated this principle with characteristic clarity during a 1962 address in the White House Rose Garden. Quoting an older maxim, he warned, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable." The statement was not rhetoric. It was a distillation of observable cause and effect. When legitimate channels elections, courts, legislatures, petitions consistently failed to produce meaningful change. Citizens eventually conclude that extra-legal methods are the only remaining option. The transition is rarely announced with fanfare. It happens in living rooms, classrooms, barracks, and workplaces. When enough individuals reach the same private verdict, the cost of inaction now exceeds the risk of upheaval. Over the past 250 years, 3 landmark revolutions in the Western Hemisphere have illustrated this process with chilling consistency. Each began with a society that believed itself immune to collapse. Each ended with the execution of its former leaders and the installation of a new regime that promised justice, yet delivered repression on a wider scale. France traded an absolute monarchy for the guillotine and Napoleon's empire. Russia exchanged a Tsarist autocracy for Bolshevik terror, and Stalin's purges. Cuba swapped a corrupt strongman for a communist dictatorship that outlasted 6 decades. In every instance, the warning signs were visible years in advance to anyone willing to read the economic ledgers and the public mood. Tonight, we will examine those signs systematically. We will define the 6 stages that every modern revolution has followed. Illustrate each stage with concrete data from France, Russia, and Cuba, and then overlay the same framework onto the United States in 2025. The purpose is not to forecast inevitable doom, but to provide a diagnostic tool. Patterns are not destiny. They are probabilities rooted in human behavior under stress. If we can identify the stage we currently occupy, we retain the ability to influence the trajectory. The alternative, ignoring the pattern until stage 5 arrives, is what transformed 3 once dominant societies into cautionary tales. To proceed with clarity, we must first establish the precise sequence that governs every revolution. The next section presents the 6-stage model in full, complete with the economic thresholds, social indicators, and political tipping points that mark the transition from stability to rupture. Every major revolution in modern history has adhered to a 6-stage sequence that operates with the reliability of a physical law. The stages are not approximate or culturally variable. They are identical in structure, differing only in the specific names, dates, and currencies involved. This framework emerges from the interplay of economic pressures, social psychology, and political mechanics. Once a society crosses the threshold of stage 1, the subsequent phases unfold in order, unless deliberate intervention interrupts the chain. The model is diagnostic, not deterministic. It reveals probabilities, not certainties. Stage 1 begins with extreme inequality that shifts from statistical abstraction to daily provocation. Wealth concentrates in a visible elite, while the majority shoulders disproportionate burdens. In measurable terms, and the top 1 to 2% of households control 25 to 40% of national assets. And tax exemptions or loopholes shield them from contributing at rates commensurate with their income. The insult is not merely financial, it is perceptual. Ordinary citizens witness luxury that appears unattainable through honest labor, while essential goods, food, shelter, medicine become precarious. This stage plants resentment, but does not yet ignite action. Stage 2 arrives when government corruption and incompetence compound the grievance. Leadership fails to address the inequality or actively exacerbates it through favoritism, waste, or external misadventure, budget deficit balloon, often fueled by military overreach or lavish court spending. Public services deteriorate while officials enrich themselves. The tipping point is reached when a clear economic crisis, famine, inflation, or war exposes the regime's inability to protect citizens' basic welfare. At this juncture, the government is no longer seen as misguided. It is viewed as illegitimate. Stage 3 marks the irreversible pivot, the destruction and radicalization of the middle class. These are the administrators, educators, merchants, and professionals who traditionally stabilize society when their own prospects collapse through debt, unemployment, or blocked mobility. They abandon reformist loyalty. Lawyers draft manifestos instead of contracts. Journalists shift from reporting to agitation. Factory owners fund opposition rather than expansion. This defection is the signal that the system has lost its technocratic backbone. Stage 4 manifests as simultaneous loss of faith in every pillar institution. Parliament is dismissed as theater. Courts are branded partisan. The press is discredited as propaganda. Police and military units hesitate to enforce orders. They privately question. Elections, if held, are perceived as rigged, regardless of outcome. The social contract dissolves into mutual suspicion. Citizens no longer believe shared rules exist. Stage 5 occurs when an organized extremist faction left enegasis, right, or ideologically hybrid, captures mass support by offering uncomplicated solutions. Their platform need not be sophisticated. It must be cathartic. Promises of land redistribution, nationalization, or punitive justice resonate because the alternative continued dysfunction feels intolerable. Moderates are sidelined or silenced. The extremists do not win majority enthusiasm. They secure majority acquiescence, born of exhaustion. Stage 6 is the collapse. The old regime is overthrown through coup, insurrection, or abdication. What follows is rarely orderly transition, civil war, purges, or foreign intervention ensue. Supply chains fracture. Currency collapses. A new authoritarian structure emerges, consolidating power under the banner of restoration. The revolution devours its architects and installs a system often more centralized and repressive than the one it replaced. This sequence is not theoretical. France, in 1789, Russia in 1917, and Cuba in 1959 traversed every checkpoint with documented precision. The numbers, tax burdens, casualty counts, wealth shares align within narrow bands. The human testimonies, diaries, parliamentary records, diplomatic cables echo the same sequence of betrayal and awakening. In the sections ahead, we will dissect each revolution stage by stage, extracting the economic thresholds and social indicators that define the path. Then we will apply the identical metrics to the United States in 2025. The comparison is unflinching but necessary. Only by seeing the pattern in full can we locate our current position and calculate the distance remaining to the point of no return. We begin with the archetype France in 1789, where the cycle originated and where every subsequent revolution found its blueprint. France in 1789 stands as the original blueprint for every modern revolution. A case where the six-stage cycle unfolded with textbook clarity across a single decade. The nation was Europe's cultural and military powerhouse, home to 27 million people, the Enlightenment's brightest salons, and a monarchy that traced its lineage back to the 8th century. Yet beneath the grandeur, structural fractures had widened for generations. By applying the model stage by stage, we see not only how the collapse occurred, but why it followed the exact sequence observed in later upheavals. Stage 1. Extreme inequality had calcified into a three-tier legal structure known as the estates. The first estate clergy, numbering roughly 130. 000 owned 10% of the land and paid no direct taxes. The second estate nobility of about 400. 000 controlled 25% of the land and enjoyed sweeping exemptions. Together, these 5% of the population contributed less than 5% of state revenue. The third estate, 26 million peasants, artisans, and bourgeois owned the remaining 65% of the land, but carried the full tax load through the tail. The gabelle and feudal dues. A single bad harvest in 1788 pushed grain prices up 60% in months. Bread, which absorbed 88% of a laborer's wage, became unaffordable for urban families. Meanwhile, Versailles hosted nightly fêtes costing millions of livres. The inequality was no longer statistical, it was visceral. Stage 2. Government corruption and incompetence reached critical mass under Louis XVI. The king was not tyrannical, he was indecisive and surrounded by courtiers who blocked reform. France had spent 5 billion livres aiding the American Revolution, then borrowed another 5 billion, equivalent to roughly $2 trillion in current terms, to cover court luxuries and interest. By 1788, half the annual budget serviced debt. When Controller General Cologne proposed taxing the privileged estates, the Parliament of Paris refused to register the edict. Louis convened the Estates General for the first time since 1614, hoping to force compliance. Instead, he handed the opposition a national stage. Stage 3. Middle-class radicalization crystallized on June 17. 1789. Delegates of the Third Estate lawyers, physicians, merchants declared themselves the National Assembly and adjourned to a nearby tennis court after being locked out of their hall. There, 576 men swore an oath not to disband until France had a written constitution. These were not starving peasants. They were educated professionals who managed the nation's commerce and jurisprudence. Their defection signaled that the regime had lost the very stratum responsible for day-to-day governance. Stage 4. Institutional legitimacy evaporated in weeks. On July 14, Parisians stormed the Bastille, a fortress holding only 7 prisoners, but symbolizing royal arbitrariness. The event was less a military victory than a public declaration that the monarchy's monopoly on force was broken. Within days, municipal militias formed across provinces. The National Assembly abolished feudal privileges on August 4, seized church lands, and issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Courts, clergy, and local parliaments either aligned with the assembly or lost authority entirely. Stage 5. Extremist consolidation came with the Jacobin Club, led by Maximilien Robespierre, a provincial lawyer. The Jacobins demanded not reform but retribution. Their newspapers framed every delay as treason. By 1792, the food shortages and war with Austria radicalized the sans-culottes, urban workers who filled assembly galleries and intimidated moderates. The promise was simple: execute the guilty, redistribute wealth, secure the revolution. Stage 6. Overthrow and chaos arrived swiftly. Louis XVI was guillotined on January 21, 1793. Marie Antoinette followed in October. The Committee of Public Safety, dominated by Robespierre, executed 17,000 by official count, and perhaps 40,000, including summary killings during the Reign of Terror, a 14-month purge that consumed nobles, clergy, Girondin rivals, and eventually Robespierre himself on July 28, 1794. France's population declined by roughly 300,000 from execution and emigration alone. The revolution that opened with slogans of liberty, equality, and fraternity closed with Napoleon Bonaparte staging a coup in 1799 and crowning himself emperor in 1804. The French case teaches us sobering arithmetic: revolutions do not recalculate the underlying economics. They merely reassign control of the ledger. Debt remained. Harvests still failed. And the new regime required even greater centralization to enforce order. The cycle was complete. We turn next to Russia in 1917, where the same 6 stages compressed into 8 months, an acceleration that reveals how war and modern communication can shrink the timeline from years to weeks. Russia in 1917 demonstrates how the 6-stage revolutionary cycle can accelerate from glacial to explosive when external war collides with internal decay. The Romanov dynasty had governed for 3 centuries over a territory spanning 11 time zones and 180 million subjects. On the surface, the empire projected invincibility, vast armies, orthodox sanctification, and a nobility intertwined with the state. Yet the same structural vulnerabilities that felled France 128 years earlier were present in amplified form. And the pressures of industrialized warfare compressed the timeline from a decade to 8 months. Stage 1. Extreme inequality operated on a feudal scale. The imperial family and court aristocracy controlled land equivalent in area to modern Belgium over 11.5 to 0.000 square miles, while 80% of the population, roughly 140 million peasants, owned less than 5% of arable soil after the 1861 emancipation. Most remained tied to mere communes, paying redemption dues that consumed half their harvest. Urban factory workers, concentrated in Petrograd and Moscow, labored 12 to 14-hour shifts in plants, lacking basic safety. A single loaf of bread required 3 hours' wages. The disparity was not hidden. It was enforced by law and custom. Stage 2. Government corruption and incompetence reached terminal velocity under Nicholas II. The Tsar viewed his role as divinely ordained, consulting mystics like Rasputin, while ignoring ministerial reports. Russia entered World War I in 1914, with enthusiasm but inadequate preparation. 12 million men were mobilized. Many received rifles only after the soldier ahead fell. By 1916, casualties exceeded 5 million. Supply lines collapsed, and inflation tripled food prices. The Duma, a limited parliament created after the 1905 unrest, was prorogued whenever it criticized policy. When Petrograd housewives queued for bread in February 1917, the regime's response was to order Cossacks to disperse them. Stage 3. Middle class and military radicalization detonated in 8 days. On International Women's Day, February 23, old-style calendar. Textile workers joined the breadlines and refused to disperse. Strikes spread to 240. 000 workers within 48 hours. Crucially, the Volinsky Regiment mutinied on February 27, fraternizing with demonstrators rather than firing. Middle-class intellectuals in the Duma formed a provisional committee demanding abdication. Nicholas, traveling by train from headquarters, received telegrams of desertion from every garrison. On March 2, he signed the abdication manifesto in a railway car outside Pskov. The 300-year Romanov line ended not in battle but in bureaucratic surrender. Stage 4. Institutional legitimacy evaporated under the provisional government led by Alexander Kerensky. Committed to liberal ideals, it retained Russia in the war to honor alliances with Britain and France. Soldiers promised land reform that never materialized. Voted with their feet desertions. Reached 2 million by summer. Soviets, workers, and soldiers' councils gained parallel authority in factories and barracks. The July Days uprising exposed the government's weakness when it required Bolshevik restraint to avoid premature coup. Stage 5. Extremist consolidation crystallized around Vladimir Lenin, who arrived at Finland Station on April 3, aboard a sealed German train. His slogan, peace, land, bread, offered immediate cessation of war, confiscation of noble estates, and food requisition. The Bolsheviks, A disciplined minority of 240. Ling Ling Ling. Controlled key Soviets. By September. Moderate socialists lost credibility as the war dragged on and grain seizures failed to feed cities. Stage 6. Overthrow and chaos unfolded with surgical speed. On October 25, November 7, new style. Red Guards sized post offices, bridges, and the Winter Palace in Petrograd in a near bloodless operation lasting hours. The provisional government was arrested while attending a banquet. Civil war erupted immediately. Reds versus whites. Greens. Nationalists. And Allied interventions. From 1,918 to 1,922. Combat. Famine and typhus claimed 10 million lives. The Czech secret police executed 200 basely Oversenci. 000. Suspected counter-revolutionaries. By 1921, the economy had contracted 80% from 1,913 levels. Lenin's new economic policy offered temporary respite. But Joseph Stalin consolidated absolute power by 1924, initiating purges that would kill millions more. The Russian acceleration teaches a critical lesson. When the military prioritizes survival over loyalty, choosing bread over orders, the cycle shifts into overdrive. War acts as a catalyst, compressing stages that once required years into weeks. We move now to the third case. Cuba in 1959, where the pattern repeated in a prosperous, urbanized society, proof that neither backwardness nor modernity grants immunity when the 6 stages align. Cuba, in 1959, provides the modern template for the revolutionary cycle, demonstrating that neither economic prosperity nor geographic proximity to a superpower can insulate a regime once the 6 stages engage. In the mid-1950s, Cuba ranked 5th in Latin America for per capita income, boasted literacy rates above 76%, and attracted more American tourists than any Caribbean destination. Havana pulsed with neon-lit casinos, luxury hotels, and a fleet of Cadillacs that exceeded Detroit's own density per resident. Yet 200 miles eastward, in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, rural families lived without electricity, clean water, or medical care, while sugar plantations largely owned by U.S. corporations exported profits that never recirculated. This juxtaposition of glamour and neglect set the stage for collapse. Stage 1. Extreme inequality was geographically stark. Urban elites and foreign investors controlled 80% of commercial agriculture and 90% of industry. Rural laborers earned 30 cents a day during harvest season, and nothing in the off-season. Land ownership concentrated in 1% of farms larger than 1,000 acres, while 70% of peasants worked plots under 25 acres or as sharecroppers. The visible contrast, Havana's Riviera Hotel, opening in 1957 at a cost of $14 million, while Oriente Province reported infant mortality from parasites at 120 per 1,000, made the disparity impossible to ignore. Stage 2. Government corruption and incompetence under Fulgencio Batista reached operatic levels. Batista seized power in 1952 coup, cancelled elections, and suspended constitutional guarantees. His regime awarded casino concessions to American mobsters like Meyer Lansky, who paid kickbacks, estimated at 30% of gross revenue. The national treasury hemorrhaged through phantom contracts and inflated military budgets. Police brutality became routine. The Bureau for the Repression of Communist Activities morphed into a general secret police that disappeared an estimated 20,000 citizens between 1,952 and 1,958. When students and journalists protested, the response was torture in La Cabaña, fortress or summary execution. Stage 3. Middle-class radicalization centered on Fidel Castro, a University of Havana-trained lawyer from a land-owning family who had run unsuccessfully for Congress in 1952. His July 26, 1953, an attack on the Moncada. Barracks failed spectacularly. 72 rebels killed or captured, but his courtroom speech, "History will absolve me," circulated as a 40-page manifesto and radicalized urban professionals, released in a 1955 amnesty. Castro regrouped in Mexico. On December 2, 1956, he landed the yacht Granma with 82 fighters. Government forces killed or captured 60 within days. The 22 survivors retreated to the mountains. But the regime's overreaction, bombing villages suspected of harboring rebels, swelled support among doctors, teachers, and small businessmen who saw Batista as irredeemable. Stage 4. Institutional legitimacy collapsed when external patrons withdrew. The U.S. State Department, alarmed by mounting atrocities and communist infiltration fears, imposed an arms embargo in March 1958 and privately informed Batista he had lost credibility. Urban civic strikes paralyzed Havana and Santiago in April. Army conscripts deserted at rates exceeding 50% in eastern provinces. Courts refused to prosecute captured rebels, citing lack of evidence under emergency laws. The press, though censored, leaked photographs of tortured bodies, eroding any remaining public trust. Stage 5. Revolutionary consolidation accelerated through retaliation cycles. Every village raised by Batista's Air Force produced 10 new guerrilla recruits. Castro's 26th of July movement coordinated with urban sabotage networks. By mid-1958, rebel columns numbered those 000 armed fighters, controlling 40% of the island's territory. Peasants supplied food and intelligence. Middle-class exiles in Miami funneled funds. Batista's December counteroffensive collapsed when entire battalions surrendered without firing. Stage 6. Overthrow and chaos arrived on January 1, 1959. Batista fled to the Dominican Republic aboard a DC-4, loaded with $300 million in cash and bonds. Rebel columns entered Havana, unopposed on January 8. Initial promises of free elections and restored democracy lasted months. By May, agrarian reform laws expropriated large holdings without compensation. Revolutionary tribunals in La Cabana executed 550 Batista officials in televised proceedings. Within 2 years, Cuba nationalized all U.S. property aligned with the Soviet Union and hosted submarine bases 90 miles from Florida. The revolution that began with middle-class outrage against corruption installed a one-party state that endured 60 years, outlasting Nina U.S. presidents. Cuba's lesson is stark. Prosperity is no shield. When the middle class concludes the regime is morally bankrupt, visible wealth can amplify resentment if it is perceived as stolen rather than earned. With 3 revolutions mapped France across a decade, Russia in 8 months, Cuba in 2 years, we now possess a calibrated instrument. The next section synthesizes the 6-stage model into a comparative table of thresholds and applies it directly to the United States in 2025, measuring where the metrics align and where divergence remains possible. The United States in 2025 confronts the same 6-stage mirror that reflected France, Russia, and Cuba before their ruptures. The metrics are not speculative. They derive from Federal Reserve surveys, Gallup polls, Census Bureau reports, and Treasury statements. When overlaid on the historical thresholds, the alignment is precise through Stage 4. Stage 5 remains latent, but organizing. Stage 6 is no longer a distant hypothesis. It is the logical endpoint of unchecked arithmetic. Stage 1. Wealth concentration has surpassed pre-revolutionary benchmarks. Federal Reserve data for Q3 2024 show the top 1% approximately 130,000 households hold 14% of total net worth, exceeding the bottom 90%'s 13% combined. This ratio is higher than France's nobility clergy share in 1788 and Russia's aristocratic land monopoly in 1914. The top 1% capture 32% of national wealth, up from 23% in 1989. Tax policy amplifies the gap. The effective federal rate for the top 400 earners averaged 8.2% in 2018, lower than the 12.5% paid by middle quintile households. Private jets logged 1 million flights in 2023, while 38 million Americans relied on SNAP benefits. The inequality is not hidden in spreadsheets. It is broadcast in yacht, marinas, and eviction courts. Stage 2. Government dysfunction has calcified into systemic paralysis. Congress registers 15% approval, the lowest sustained level since polling began in 1974. The national debt stands at $36 trillion, or 122% of GDP, higher than post-World War II peaks when adjusted for peacetime conditions. Annual interest payments reached $0.5 trillion in fiscal 2024, surpassing the entire defense budget of $886 billion. Déficit average $8 trillion annually in a full employment economy, financed by Treasury issuance that crowds private investment. Lobbying expenditures hit $4.2 billion in 2023, with 12,000 registered influencers, drafting language later enacted verbatim. Infrastructure grades from the American Society of Civil Engineers remain D+, with 43% of roads in poor condition and 7.5% of bridges structurally deficient. The response to crises: wildfires, hurricanes, supply chain shocks, defaults to emergency declarations rather than preventive investment. Stage 3. Middle-class erosion has hollowed the demographic core. The median home price reached $412. 0 inches, Q4, 2024. Or 8.2 times median household income, the highest affordability ratio in census records, dating to 1963. Down payment requirements exclude 62% of renters under 35. Student debt totals $74 trillion across 45 million borrowers, with average balances of $38,000, delaying marriage, homeownership, and childbirth by 7-10 years. Real median wages grew 0.8% annually from 2019 to 2024, while healthcare premiums rose 4%. Defined benefit pensions cover only 15% of private sector workers, down from 60% in 1980. The professional class teachers, starting at $41, 0 inches, 28 states. Engineers facing H-1B wage suppression experiences downward mobility for the first time since the Great Depression. Stage 4. Institutional legitimacy has fractured across every pillar. Trust in the Supreme Court fell to 40% in 2024 Gallup data, the lowest since tracking began in 1973. Media trust averages 32%, with partisan splits exceeding 50 points. Election integrity perceptions are bifurcated. 46% of 2020 voters across parties believe the presidential contest was compromised. Per Rasmussen and Monmouth polls, the FBI registers 48% confidence. Local police 51%. Social media algorithms amplify confirmation bias, creating parallel information ecosystems. The January 6, 2021 events and subsequent prosecutions are interpreted as insurrection by one half and political persecution by the other. The nation operates as two republics under one constitution, each viewing the other's institutions as captured. Stage 5. Extremist organization is coalescing without yet achieving critical mass. On the left, 41% of Gen Z respondents in a 2024 Axios Ipsos survey agree that the system is so broken it must be torn down and rebuilt. Mutual aid networks and decentralized protest cells coordinate via encrypted apps. On the right, 38% of registered voters in a 2024 YouGov poll endorse a strong leader willing to break rules to restore order. Militia memberships have tripled since 2016. Per Southern Poverty Law Center estimates, both flanks reject incrementalism. Both diagnose Stage 4 identically, but prescribe incompatible remedies. Stage 6. Collapse is arithmetic, not rhetorical. If Stage 5 crystallizes, the sequence predicts cascading failures, supply chain seizures under labor strikes, currency devaluation from debt monetization spirals, military splintering along regional or ideological lines, state-federal standoffs over revenue sharing, and foreign opportunism in cyber or proxy domains. The endpoint is not gradual decline, but phased transition, stable democracy to fragmented authority in months, not decades. We occupy Stage 5. The distance to Stage 5 is measured in trust metrics and mobilization thresholds, not years. The conclusion ahead distills the pattern's immutable logic and isolates the single variable that has, in rare historical instances, arrested the cycle before irreversible momentum. France in 1789. Russia in 1917. Cuba in 1959, three societies at divergent points of development, each convinced its foundations were unbreakable. Each whispered the same fatal assurance: we are the exception. The pattern paid no heed. Inequality calcified. Governments faltered. The middle class defected. Institutions hollowed. Extremists organized. And collapse followed with mathematical certainty. The United States in 2025 stands at Stage 4. Metrics aligned more closely with pre-revolutionary thresholds than at any juncture since the Civil War. The arithmetic is unforgiving, but it is not yet conclusive. Patterns endure because human responses under stress remain predictable. They fracture only when a sufficient cross-section of society chooses collective restraint over partisan triumph. History records. Rare instances. England's Glorious Revolution of 1688. America's New Deal reforms of the 1930 seconds, where Stage 4 pressures prompted concession rather than confrontation. The common denominator was a critical mass of citizens across ideological lines who prioritized preserving the mechanism of peaceful change above securing immediate victory. No single law or leader engineered the pivot. It emerged from distributed recognition that the alternative was mutual destruction. You have now traced the cycle in full. The data points are public. The parallels verifiable. Understanding does not guarantee reversal, but ignorance guarantees repetition. Share this analysis with one individual who still dismisses the possibility: colleague, neighbor, family member. The moment a threshold of shared awareness forms, the pattern's momentum weakens. If the evidence resonates, signal agreement with a like. In the comments, note the stage you assess we occupy. The aggregate will serve as a real-time diagnostic. Subscribe to remain calibrated. As indicators evolve, Stage 5 begins not with barricades, but with quiet defections, soldiers declining orders, professionals withholding expertise, investors reallocating capital. I will document each shift with the same measured data, one frame at a time. History is merciless. Yet, it is not mysterious. See you in the next rewind.